A rift is developing. It's a worrying one, being between game developers and many of the people who play their games. This has been highlighted by the recent Epic Games Store situation where Boogie2988 has been targeted as a figurehead of gaming coverage on YouTube. It's a worrying situation, especially when we start seeing tweets like this one from Gearbox Games lead Randy Pitchford. Division does none of us good. So today, we have a hell of a problem to solve. Hello and welcome back to another report. Today we have a massive issue to sort out, and it really is one that needs sorting out, because it doesn't seem like the Epic Games Store is going anywhere anytime soon, not with a bankroll like what Epic have. And I find myself in an odd position. I create game industry coverage on this channel that's consumer first, yet I'm writing this video after sitting in on my game studio's weekly production meeting. Yeah, I'm in a bit of a middle ground here. I'm very critical of Epic as a customer, but as somebody who wants 8812 to be the norm, as a developer, it leaves me in a funny spot. So let's start off with the inciting incident. Boogie made the following video. Borderlands 3 release date, timed, exclusive to Epic Store, 6 months, no Steam. This was, of course, in response to the Borderlands 3 leaks, which, in fairness, did seem like a pretty sure thing because they were from official Twitter videos. In Boogie's video, he talks about the pros and the cons of the store. He does, of course, mostly focus on the consumer's position, but he definitely does touch on the developer's position. He did launch a video with what was clearly a joke, but past that, things were very reasonable. Boogie came to the conclusion that given the money that Epic are handing out and the deals that they're striking, that he didn't really blame 2K that much. Ultimately, Boogie said that it was down to the aggression of Epic's growth strategy. Something that I think is a fair criticism of Epic. Indeed, it's one of the things that Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney said is a, quote, fair target for ire. Well, this prompted notable developer David Jaffe to tweet against Boogie, leading to him getting quite a lot of flack from developers. David tweeted in a, I believe now deleted tweet, that he is sick of clickbait gamers, talking about how he is sick of cynical, negative content from people who are always angry. Now, that may be a fair thing to say sometimes, but not at Boogie's video, which was very reasonable and level-headed. Indeed, it is true that the negative news cycle has been a massive viewership draw, so we have to ask ourselves why. Well, I think it is quite clearly because consumers are not thrilled by many modern business practices. Looking at my own recent coverage, well, Borderlands 3 is doing something newsworthy, something that consumers dislike. For my part, I attempted to cover it with full context of why Epic is an attractive deal for developers and for publishers, but it still is something that people don't like. Then when I moved down the channel, we've got a Fallout 76 story. Well, again, that's literally a developer going against their word by adding in gameplay impacting microtransactions. And thankfully, the second largest video in this channel is a positive one, covering No Man's Sky. But generally speaking, the industry is doing a lot wrong. It's doing a lot that people don't like, and it is right to point that out. Anthem recently dominated the news cycle, well, because it was indicative of many problems felt by consumers. Equally, The Division 2 did fantastically with the news cycle. Why? Because people felt it was doing so much right. Really, this whole wave of online gamer news was kicked off during the crazy autumn where we had Battlefront 2's insane loot boxes and the depth to which Shadow of War's microtransactions ruined the game. So, I'm sorry, David, but for the people who play games, i.e. the people who play the games that, you make and that I hope to eventually make, these are bad things. These are leading to games that are not as good, games that are often exploitative. We cannot expect the press to just act as a marketing wing. Just like how the regular press outside the gaming world works, game commentators and websites should be critical of what developers and publishers do. That is the feedback loop that keeps the industry in line because, let's be real, self-regulation is often a little bit idealistic. That's why the press is there, to both call people out when they do wrong, but also to praise them when they do right. Boogie went on to make a follow-up video, which, again, was indeed quite reasonable. He expressed his confusion over his critics seemingly not listening to most of his video, going on to reiterate how he's a bit sad how the whole thing has happened, and show how the original video did indeed cover both sides. This then led to a series of tweets from Zen of Design saying that Boogie's video was using apocalyptic terms. They then went on to provide a long thread of tweets, many of which actually covered things that Boogie said in the video. And that shows a lack of willingness to, well, cooperate. It feels like communication in bad faith, and that is something that I disapprove of. So we have many developers on one side and many customers on the other side, but it's very important to note that the most outwardly negative groups of people from both sides will be heard the most because they make the most noise, even though they likely don't represent the average view of either group. This is one of the very interesting mechanics of modern social media, and it has a distorting effect on our discourse. It makes things seem more black and white than they actually are. To gamers, it seems like more developers look down on them, and to developers, it makes it look like more gamers dislike them. In reality, it's just not that bad, but it might feel that way because visibility is not weighted by truthfulness. It is weighted by emotional resonance. In reality, this is a very simple problem. Most people don't like exclusives, though mostly when the exclusives feel arbitrary. I think most people do understand and accept first-party console exclusives, likely knowing that those games they really do exist because of their role as system sellers, and how, well, if you 100% fund the game for your console, you kind of get the right to do that. However, arbitrary exclusives are not like that much. Why? Well, there are a few different reasons here. There is less choice for the consumer, and that's a really big one. Within the bounds of the product they're interested in purchasing, it is less competitive because, well, there's no competition between marketplaces, therefore there's less choice. Now, if it's a first-party game, I think that's fine, I think we all get that, but if it's a third-party title that's an exclusive just because of a deal being struck, well, I think that feels less acceptable to most customers. Sure, many people will still understand the finances behind it, but that's not going to change the fact that their experience is being made worse by having to install another launcher, particularly if it is one that is lacking in features. This is all in a time where people feel as well like they are the product, having their personal information going to many different groups. While that is all, I guess, fine, and most companies are pretty decent in privacy, it still is a concern, something that Epic have managed to feed into, at least with how hacked together their storefront is. The Epic Games Store is then not as fully featured as its competitors, plus unlike, say, Uplay and Origin, which many people have begrudgingly accepted, it isn't, at least for the more vocal audience, because of there being first-party games, like there is for Uplay and for Origin. That does make Epic's stuff feel particularly arbitrary, especially when, well, these, sort of core gamers know that it's mostly down to the financial success of a game that they don't particularly like, with Fortnite. So, in summary, it is anti-competitive within the bounds of a single game release, even though it broadly is competition between the two stores. The Epic Store has fewer features, there have been widespread privacy concerns, which, true or not, are actually being felt by people. There are things like not having always-on reviews, which feel very untrustworthy to customers, plus it's the first time that we've had a new mandatory-feeling launcher in quite some time, which has dredged up disgruntled sentiment towards Origin, Uplay, and Battle.net. While it is perfectly reasonable to agree or to disagree with these points, I think it is reasonable to say that these are valid ways for people to feel. They're not completely, they're not a load of BS. Of course, devs really do have a different set of incentives here. First, and being an indie who I guess has to prepare for this eventually, I really feel this one hard. So staying afloat is really hard, especially even if you sell a game. So here's the deal, right? You might have a $250K publishing deal. During the development of your game, that's fine. You burn through your $250K, grand. You're at the finish line, okay? Your game's now been released, and your bank account's running on fumes because you've built your game. You then have a bunch of staff to pay. You've got bills to pay. Well, thankfully, your game is going to sell well, right? Well, chances are your publishing contract stipulates something like this, a 60-40 revenue split with 60% going to the publisher and 40% going to the developer, until the publisher's spend has been recouped, with, at that point, the revenue split then being 60% to the developer and 40% to the publisher. That's a very common one that I've heard a few times. So in some cases, this can be a very challenging financial situation. It's entirely possible to finish a game, for it to go out, and then not to be able to make payroll for 2 months. I mean, hey, the storefronts don't actually pay out instantly. You often have to wait a month or two. So for indie devs or AA's, having an upfront cash deal from Epic gives them a lot of security, and that will seem like an attractive proposition. Sure, people might be pissed that a studio decided to take a deal, but for the head of a studio, often the first priority will be the health and the well-being of their staff, and that definitely does include not having to miss payroll or worse, let people go. Again, I think that for many people who dislike what Epic are doing, I mean, a lot of that's me included, this seems like an understandable thing. Simply put, the incentives are not perfectly aligned between the customer and the developer because Epic are giving such a strong deal. Next, we've got the 88-12 revenue split. Flat out, that's just so much better for Steam, especially for AA and indies. Really, especially for indies who would always be falling under Steam's 30% revenue split, not their 25 or 20% ones, which are only for games that sell more than $10 and $50 million in revenue. Indeed, that revenue split would mean that if they have a publisher, the publisher would recoup their spend in the game faster, meaning that the developer would reach the part of their contract where they, are earning the most part of their sales. And that's something that often will be kind of key to a developer's survival. So, indeed, many developers are then seeing attacks on Epic as an attack on the 88-12 split. As good as Steam's features are, I think most gamers would probably prefer that the developers earn more money and the middlemen earn less money, and I think, especially for indie titles, they would think that. For an example, Epic said that of their 12% cut, about 5.5% is cost, meaning that the 12% revenue split has them in great profit. That means that of Valve's 30%, 24.5% is clean profit. Yeah, when developers are struggling to get by, struggling to meet payroll, and we have job losses, the middlemen who they rely on getting such a massive cut of the profit for essentially no work, I mean, I don't like that, especially when Epic shows us that 12% is financially viable. So Epic right now is annoying customers, but is good for developers. And all of this is at the cost of a sizable segment of the community and creating a lot of anger. So I think that being defensive and dismissive for developers is not helpful. Instead, it's far more reasonable to say something along the lines of this. Hey everyone, we know that the Epic Games Store is not your first preference, or probably isn't your first preference, but it secures the stability of our studio and the jobs of our employees. If you don't want to follow us to the Epic Store, then we're sorry to see you go, and we hope to see you on the Steam release. Now sure, a response like that would have negative feedback overall. It would invoke some ire, but you know what? It would not be as bad as what's been happening. What riles people up a lot more is developers being dismissive of their concerns, of developers having emotional outbursts that are very, full of anger. These things, like Randy Pitchford's tweet, are bad for all developers for the reasons that I outlined earlier on in this video about why communications are kind of problematic. Epic isn't going anywhere. The only path forward is for developers and players to have better communication and a willingness to understand each other's perspectives, as much as that might involve something that is mutually inconvenient. Look, Randy Pitchford making disastrous tweets like what he made, that does nobody any good. As much as it simply isn't the case, many gamers view devs as a group, and many devs view gamers as one group. So then the cycle continues, and we just have anger and discord. Right now, I feel like a lot of devs are acting in a very top-down fashion, and I think they're being dismissive of a lot of people's concerns. And I think by doing that, a lot of blame does kind of rest on devs here. A lot of the public communications could have been just handled so much better, but instead we're seeing a lot of people who feel personally attacked when they're not being personally attacked, and therefore lash out. And they don't lash out specifically at people, no, they just lash out at gamers as a group. And that just is so unhelpful. So there you go, that is my thought on the rift between many gamers and many developers. Not all gamers and not all developers, but, some of them, and certainly many of the visible ones. I think the path forward is extremely clear and extremely reasonable if we were to assume that Epic are not going to stop what they're doing, and as much as I don't like what they're doing, all signs do point to Epic not stopping. It just requires good communication and a willingness for devs to understand that, yes, the 88-12 is great, and yes, the upfront money is great, but, we should at least, when we announce this, show our customers that we understand that there's elements of this that they don't like, and, not take attacks as being personal. It's been kind of sad, actually it's been very sad to see this unfold in such a disastrous way. Ultimately, I hope Epic Games Store exclusives stop. I hope they stop soon. And I hope that 88-12 becomes the norm, because that means the middlemen who don't provide that much of a service are getting less. Maybe they're getting something closer to what they deserve, instead of, taking 5% and making the rest of the 20, or not the 25 pure profit, which I think is frankly a little bit ridiculous, at least in the current day. So there you go. That's my thoughts on this situation and the big rift that was, I think, most prominently exposed by the attacks on Boogie2988. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know what you think down below, and with that, see you next time.